Buenos días. Afortunadamente hace mal tiempo.
Good morning. We have bad weather, so we are quite happy to be here with a sunny day. It would be much more difficult, but today's program is worth it. And as we have said at the beginning, security and defense are going to be the buzzword of next mandate. It is a fact today. The High Representative is for the foreign policy and security. And security was a bit forgotten at the beginning because security wasn't an issue. And now it is an issue. So we have to say that I not only have the head of the Commission and the Council, but also have the head of foreign policy and of security and defense. The defense policy is a part of the security policy. It is not in the title, but it is a part of security and defense. It is a hot issue, not only because of the Ukraine war, but because of the preparation we have begun to reinforce our security. I'm going to give the floor to Cristina Manzano, who is going to be in charge of chairing this session. I would like to thank those speakers who are here. Security is of utmost importance, and therefore we have an institute, the European Union. We have a think tank. This think tank has its headquarters in Paris, and Stephen Everett is at the head of this institute. It is called European Institute for Security Studies, an institute to look at the issues in matters of security. It's not very well known, but it is there. They are working on security, and we have its director with us. And then also we have someone that has been addressing many complex issues derived of the community institutions in order to prepare our response capacity. So that's all. So I give you the floor, Cristina Manzano, to present this session. Thank you, Stephen, and thank you, Barbara. I would like to start thanking you for the invitation. It is always a pleasure to be here. And in this scene, it is an occasion to dedicate a few hours to think about where is the EU. So we do not talk as much of security and defense, although it is one of the major issues. And currently, it has been at the beginning of the European project, from the very beginning. And I would like to talk about the project of the European Community of Defense, which was the first initiative after the creation of the coal and steel community, and after several stages was blocked by the France veto. So the defense policy went through a lot of drawbacks, and with the arrival of with the end of the Cold War, Europe thought it was a land of peace and prosperity, and defense issues were left aside because we thought that this welfare state was going to be enough to progress towards a world in peace. But it is sadly not the case. We not in this scenery, and we can talk about a clash that was with the arrival of Trump president to the White House, because of its questioning the European project and the role played by NATO and the U.S. role in the defense of Europe. And it was just the first sight we saw to talk about the new mechanism, or the first mechanism to reinforce this peace and this security, and how to reinforce this pillar of defense and to have a common policy of security. As we all know, and has been said many times here and in other talks and conferences, the real clash was with the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and with the fact that we had a war very near to our borders, and that our security, our hard security, it is, what do we understand by security? We are talking about defense, defense industry, but the security has reached other dimensions, and I would like to address this aspect as well. But the war in Ukraine has awakened us, and with this war, we know that we have to address the security in an autonomous way. This strategic autonomy is the word, and this was the first call. And last year we developed a lot of tools, the strategic compass, and the EU has acknowledged those threats, but also we have many inner challenges when dealing with this issue. We have to decide if we want to rely on the US for our security. What is the complement? How can we enlarge the European capacities, and how can we work together with the NATO? What would happen if Trump becomes president of the US? How can we manage all the threats of third parties that are not Russia? So all these issues are going to be addressed during this session. We have only time only to 12:30. So I would like to, if I may, say something more. Last words. We are going to talk about policy instruments and decisions taken by the EU. But one of the major changes along these 2 years has been the changes of the European public opinion that has declared itself peaceful and wanting the peace. But nevertheless, there has been since the start of the war in the different public opinion. First of all, we are supporting Ukraine, and many efforts are being done by the different member states. But also, we want to reinforce this defense and security capacity with different nuances. For example, where we say that we want to reinforced when talking about the different institutes, and in the different opinion polls, we see that there is a need to reinforce the European defense capacity. But there is no consensus in the fact of creating a European army. So how can we progress and go forward? So I give the floor to the High Representative. Well, I think I will take the floor at the end. So I give the floor to Stephen Evers. He is the director of the European Institute of Security Studies. Yours is the floor.
Many, many thanks, and good morning, everyone. Thank you, Christina. Thank you very much, High Representative dear Josep. If I can allow myself, it really is for me a special moment to be here. For those who don't know, I had the privilege of working with Josep for a number of years, working together, writing things, articles and various things. And I've spent sort of 20 years in the bubble in Brussels, working with different high representatives, Javi Solana and others. And then a year ago, a bit more, came the opportunity to lead this institute, which I now have the honor of leading, which is indeed the EU Institute for Security Studies. There are many brilliant think tanks in Europe, very smart people in many universities and experts, but we have only one EU think tank indeed, as you recalled, required, mandated, tasked to think in EU terms, not national, but in EU terms about security challenges and what are we supposed to do about that. And I see it very much as part of the task of the Institute to do what we are doing this morning, and what we're doing this whole week. Which is to discuss amongst Europeans on how we see the world, how we see the challenges, and what we're going to do about them. So for me, it's really a great privilege to be also in Santander, which is a very particular and beautiful place in terms of the venue, but also in terms of the, let's say, the fauna that we have here. It was recalled also yesterday. It's not very many European leaders like Josep Borrell, who engages a week long into this kind of discussions and brings his friends, his colleagues, his experts from around Europe and beyond to do that. So it's really something, it's a special moment. I say this without spin to do this. So as he and also Christina recalled, security and defense matters are really now at the top of the agenda. Last mandate, you may remember, was all green digital, green digital, green digital. Huh? Those were the watchwords. We are now in a different phase, and security, defense, together with innovation, and by the way, the two things are not totally separate, as was also discussed, are really now at the top, and one has to acknowledge, because there's a degree of fear. The world is becoming more and more complicated, more and more contested, more and more dangerous for Europeans. So what I would like to do, if that is agreeable, to give you some pointers as to what's happening now in the war in Ukraine. As was recalled, this is really the watershed that has dynamized the debate on security and defense in a very dramatic fashion. Combine that a little bit with some reflections on what's happening in the United States. I just come from the United States, and what's happening there in the elections, because that will have such a bearing on the kinds of choices that we collectively as Europeans will need to make. And then I'll conclude with some thoughts on the exam question. So what does that mean then for European security and defense agenda? But just some indications. As behooves a think tank, I will have some ideas, maybe some even provocative, but this is what we're here to do, no? To discuss also things that are not so straightforward, and how we deal with that. And then my friend and colleague Barbara will continue and run you through much more detail the various instruments and policy tracks that are underway on the strategic compass. And I think it nicely complements each other, but we'll let you judge later on what you make of that. So those are the three parts I want to touch on Ukraine, the US elections, and the future of European defense. Now, let's begin with the war in Ukraine, and let's begin by recalling what this is about. And in my view, it's important to acknowledge that this is an imperial war. It's an imperial mindset driving everything that's happening. I want to begin by sharing a story with you. We had some, I thought, compelling stories yesterday as well, personal. Last time I was in Ukraine, was in May. And as is customary, you have meetings with the government. I was, of course, also meeting with think tankers and so on. And we discussed at this dinner, hosted by the EU ambassador, we discussed everything. How the war is going, what's happening on the front, the ammunition story, the air defense shortages. What about this EU accession? Is it really going to happen? NATO, what is happening? The US, we discussed everything in a beautiful evening among policymakers, diplomats, think tankers, and what have you. And just as we were about to stand up and go home to the hotel, there was a woman, and she said, listen, there's something that bothers me. And it stays that this debate tonight was beautiful, was good, but it stayed too much at a superficial level. And I want to share with you my personal perspective. And she said, listen, I am here in Kyiv, and my husband is at the front line. She's a lady in her mid-30s. And I have not seen him in over a year, because he has to fight, and there are no often possibilities to return. And last month, my husband had his first, let's say, opportunity to come back. And we had to decide, do we start a family in the middle of a war? This was the question that they had to confront. It's a very difficult question at the human level. And she said, it was a long discussion, but we decided yes. And today I'm pregnant. And the reason why I decided to, with my husband, to start this family, even in the middle of the war, is that Ukraine cannot disappear. That's the word she used, cannot disappear. So this is how she sees, and with her husband, she sees the conflict. And we will fight until the end, so our children will not have to fight. Now, I just shared this, you stayed with me, and it was a very emotional moment, because it's one thing to discuss politics, and then you see what it comes down to. And it stayed with me because I think that this is important for us to realize. It may be also far away from Santander, but this is a war for them of an existential nature. They have to win. They have to protect the sovereignty. They have to protect Ukraine as a state, as a nation, as a sovereign democratic entity. But I would suggest this is also for us, because the principles, and we often repeat this, and I think it is worth repeating, the principles at stake is really what kind of Europe will we have, what kind of international global order will we have? Will aggression be punished or will it pay off? That's what this is about. And I think everything that we've seen of Vladimir Putin is that he will not stop until he is stopped. There have been so many opportunities for him to de-escalate if he wanted that, if that was genuinely his interest. So I think that that is where we are. And I think for Europeans, we should not see the Ukrainians as good guys, but others, right? The other, as they say in the academic literature, but as us. But then the question, really the exam question is, how will this end? You may remember Wes Clark was the Supreme Commander of NATO in the Kosovo War, and he asked, I think the then Prime Minister Tony Blair asked him, General, how will this end? Tell me how this will end. And the honest answer is that we don't know, but we can write the endings together. This is how we should, I think, position ourselves. It's not an external force over which we have no influence. No, we have choices to make that will shape the outcome of this war. Now, a little bit of a recap. How did we get here? The story of 2022, I mean, it's a complex story, but maybe some of the highlights. It was, I think, about the Russians miscalculating. It's striking how little the Russians know about Ukraine. You know, for neighbors, for people who purport to have been, brotherly peoples, how little they knew about their neighbors. Because Ukraine is a real country, and real countries fight back. And Ukraine's fighting back, so it's a real country, it exists. Otherwise it wouldn't fight back. I think Ukrainians showed immense bravery, and I think Europeans broke taboos. I say this sitting next to the High Representative, I mean, I think deserves praise for having led us to break taboos. And one of the major taboos that we broke was this use of EU instruments, EU financial assistance, to finance the supply of weapons, of lethal weapons, to a country at war in Europe. Now, this is unprecedented for those who study a little bit the history of the European Union. Started as a peace project, is forbidden under the treaty. I mean, there were all sorts of legal, mental, political obstacles that stood in the way, but we said, no, you win wars with weapons, and Ukraine needs weapons, and we need to help supply them. So that was a big step that we took. 23 was a more complicated year for the war, for Ukraine above all. It turned into a war of attrition. The famed counter-offensive wasn't as successful as we had hoped. The losses were mounting. And the Russians showed that they were pretty good at adjusting too. It's not only the Ukrainians that were smart, and the Russians were pretty smart too. But the big strategic change was the reopening of the Black Sea, which is of fundamental importance for the Ukrainians to have their own access to global markets. It's also important for the rest of the world. Remember, we spoke so much in 22 and 23 about grain exports. Do we talk about this anymore? No, because the access to global markets has been a step. EU was ramping up its support, but we also became increasingly aware of our limitations. It's easier if you have stocks. You take from your stocks, if you want to. Not everybody wants to give everything from the stock, but that's easier. If you have to restock, that already becomes difficult. If you then start to build and develop the weapons, it's a different story. And I think if we're honest, we also started to see some cracks at the political level in 23. Within the European Union, where this rock-solid unity started to become less solid. 24, we heard this word stalemate so much. I'll come on to that in a moment. But perhaps the most important thing of 24 is the systematic destruction by Russia of Ukraine's civilian infrastructure, in particular the energy infrastructure. It is unbelievably devastating what they have done. And we should be honest, this is also partly due to the cost of delays, the delays in air defense in particular. But, and this is now happening right now, we'll talk a little bit more about it, Ukraine is also trying to regain the strategic initiative. Huh? Now the question before us, what does this all mean for us? Are we serious about sustaining our support? And in particular, what if the US were to step back? What does that mean for European decisions and choices then? Now, a little bit, I give you some slides on just the state of the front line in the east. This is January on the left and August on the right. And I want to begin by giving you this image, that despite this overwhelming advantage in terms of manpower and in terms of ammunition that the Russians have, they have not broken through in a significant way in the east. Yes, there are significant and incremental gains that they are making, but there's been no collapse on the side of Ukraine, irrespective of, despite these very, very serious, it's an unequal fight. Let's not remember, it's a very, very unequal fight, this. But, and this, you have to balance this with this image. This is the image of all the attacks against civilian infrastructure, in particular energy. It's been devastating. By some calculations, 7 to 8 gigawatts of power generation has been destroyed by Russia. You cannot have a country without electricity. It's impossible. Nothing functions beyond a certain. Yes, you can do decentralized generation and you can try to fix things as best as you can, but you know, civilization at a certain point comes to a halt if there is no electricity. There is this bittersweet phrase that you hear in Kiev, that they are the greenest economy in Europe because they have no more coal. It's very bittersweet. So this is the thing that preoccupies people the most. And that's why we discussed so much last year, but also this year, about the vital need for supplies of air defense, air defense, air defense, air defense. When you hear Ukrainians, they sort of understand, they regret, they don't like, but they understand our limitations on ammunition, because it's objectively very difficult to ramp up production quickly. Global markets are extremely strong. Everybody wants to buy artillery, missiles, whatever. So prices have shot up. It is objectively very difficult. But what really gets to them is the lack in their perception of us supplying the air defense, which we do have, There are, of course, there are reasons why countries withhold giving their air defense assets. To do with their own needs, and because there's this fear that maybe tomorrow you may need it yourself. What does this graph tell you? At the top is Europe, at the bottom is the United States. It tells you two messages I want to stress. The first message is that, and the air defense is at the top, the orange bar, is that for Europe it's about at half the level of the supplies of battle tanks and howitzers, which as measured as the percentages of the stock that you have given. So you have a certain stock of different weapons category, and what is the percentage of that stock that you supply? And there you get the figure, it's about 6% for Europe. Then at the bottom is the United States, and there's a double message in there. The United States, as say the air defense share of its supplies is about the same as the tanks, but the share of its total stock that the United States has shared is less than that of Europe. And I include this graph that to stress this point. You often hear that, you know, yes, Europeans lead on the economic side and the EU accession and various actions, but it's the Americans that are fundamental into the weapon supply. That is true, that is true. But it's also true, of course, that they can, because their stocks are so much greater than they are of the Europeans. This is a little bit the story on the weapon supplies and the air defense. And it seems to me that it remains of fundamental nature that we continue to do more than we are at present in helping Ukrainians protect their critical infrastructure, their major cities, because otherwise there is no country left at a certain point. Now let's get on to the more recent news, which surprised everyone, including the Russians, which is this incursion into the Kursk region. About 1,000 square kilometers, they say. It's impressive. Of course, the question is, why have the Ukrainians decided to do this? And from my perspective, probably the most important reason is to shift the strategic narrative. I mentioned earlier, we discussed it with some at dinner yesterday, it is about getting away from this manner in which most people look at this conflict, this war, as a war of attrition, in which time is on the side of the Russians, because they have deeper reserves of everything, of people, of money, of political time as well. So the Ukrainians, I think, I feel rightly, decided to go to a war of movement, because a war of attrition doesn't suit Ukraine. A war of movement suits Ukraine. I think there are additional reasons why they did it. Of course, it's easier if you were to get to negotiations, we'll come on to that in a second, if you also occupy terrain for future land swaps with your opponent. It's not only about you have to withdraw from my sovereign land. I have assets of you and we can do swap. Also swaps of people, of soldiers, because the Ukrainians have captured quite a number of Russian soldiers. And of course, the liberation of Ukrainian soldiers or civilians, including children that have been kidnapped, has enormous payoff for a Ukrainian government under pressure at home, under pressure to show results, under pressure to show successes. And the liberation of bringing your own people back, of course, has an important diplomatic, political benefit. It's a booster for the morale of Ukraine. I mean, basically, for months, if not a year, they have been simply at the receiving end of what I mentioned. This relentless bombardments of cities, civilian infrastructures, children, hospitals. You have all seen these images. And at a certain point, you want to change. You have to change. You have to change. But it's important to keep in mind two things. The Russian offensive in the Donetsk is still advancing, and there's indication even of this morning of that being intensified right now, and the situations are not the same. It's the heavy fortifications in the east make it, in military terms, a fundamental different picture. But I think this is interesting. Now maybe let's talk about this negotiation. They seem so far away because both parties have stated their military objectives, and Putin says, unless I've achieved my military objectives, the war will continue. I will not stop. The question in Ukraine is more, I think, nuanced. It's a very difficult topic for Ukrainians for all the obvious reasons. The graph on the left tells you, as a breakdown of the kinds of motivations, what would you like to achieve? What would potential negotiations be about? And the pink slide is 45. They say, well, we could envisage Ukraine losing potentially a part of its currently occupied territory, but what really matters is that we are and remain a sovereign democratic nation that can make its own free choices, that can join the European Union, that can join NATO one day. And let's say I paraphrase this, they do not define victory in territorial terms, they define it in what kind of country Ukraine will be at the end of this. The 26 green percent are people saying, no, the focus has to be on the territorial liberation of the entire territory of Ukraine, even if that comes at the expense of accepting limitations on our sovereignty. Should we become a neutral country? Limitations on the size of our army, and so on and so forth. And of course, there's also sometimes a geographic breakdown, because it depends on where you are in Ukraine, how you answer this question. But I think this is a fundamental question. What are negotiations eventually about? What is victory eventually be about? How do we define victory? And of course, I should preface this, it's the Ukrainians that shall define this, not us. The graph on the right is this, what I call sort of the fear of abandonment. Very present in Kiev. Are you, it says a sort of breakdown, are you concerned that the United States will negotiate a deal, potential deal with Russia, without involving the Ukrainian government? And this was done in May, when Trump was riding high, and Trump was talking every day about solving this problem in one day. But this fear of abandonment, I think, is very prevalent. Okay, what have we done? I go a bit faster. As EU in 24, well, we have done a lot. Financial assistance. We've done the formal start of the EU accession negotiations. You remember the scene with Viktor Orban leaving the room. Okay, it was important to get it done, I think, because it is important to keep Ukrainians also motivated. This is the ultimate prize. I think we've done a lot of training of soldiers. We'll come on to that in a moment. We've moved forward on the use of the proceeds of Russian immobilized assets. And we've advanced with work of integrating Ukraine also in the developing strategy. EU defense industrial strategy was amongst others, was a very significant event in May this year in Brussels, where representatives from the Ukrainian defense industry were brought to Brussels as we ourselves roll out our defense industry, and Barbara will talk, amongst others, about that. My main takeaway was that the Ukrainian defense industry is, in some respects, streets ahead of the European behemoths, sort of maybe unrespectfully I can call them the legacy companies. There's an enormous amount of energy and innovation, and we have enormous interest ourselves to tap into that. What's happening on drones, what's happening on electronic warfare, what's happening in fusion of civilian and military technology. The Ukrainians are, I mean, the innovation cycles for us is weeks. And you see the representatives of the European companies, oh, we think in months and years. For me, it was a very interesting meeting to get that illustrated. On the NATO side, there are various forms of assistance that are being rolled out as well. But, and it's important, the Washington summit ended again without clarity on the path to accession, principally due to US, but also German and other concerns. Okay, enough about Ukraine. Let's move now to the United States. A few weeks ago, it looked like there wasn't a race, and now there is one. I spent a few weeks now in the United States over the summer. What you sense and you notice, it's a deeply polarized country, and that remains the case. The vast majority people have made up their mind who they're going to vote for. It's a country divided against itself. But with Biden stepping out and Harris now the Democratic presumptive nominee, or a few days, there is a race now. But as everybody knows, US elections are won in a handful of states, the swing states, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, Arizona, Georgia, and North Carolina. And there will depend so much also on the ground battle, as the Americans call it. So what kind of local organization do you have to get people to vote? What's the turnout? It's a very complicated game. But there is a race, and nationally Harris is up 2.7%. These are the latest figures I could retrieve. So that's impressive, because it was very different a few weeks ago. But, and there's always a but with me. This but is, if you go back to 2016, at this point in the race, Clinton, Trump, remember? Clinton was up by 6%. So, and we all know how that ended, no? So it's not a done deal by any means, but some things have changed. I think on the Democrat side, there's much more enthusiasm for Harris than there was for Biden. I think Democrats feared that they were stuck with the wrong candidate, and now they have embraced Harris. Not all reservations about her have gone away, but the enthusiasm is palpable, is noticeable. She has an advantage, a huge advantage over Biden and Trump in terms of favorability, perhaps also because she's less well known yet. And crucially, she has flipped, she has turned the advantage that Trump had in 4 of the 6 swing states to her advantage. And that's crucial. She doesn't need more votes in California. She needs votes in Pennsylvania, in Wisconsin, and in Michigan. It's actually those 3. Those 3 are really the ones that I mean, it's a crazy system, man, but that's where the US election will be decided. So for us, of course, this matters enormously. We don't have a vote, but we have a stake in the US election. Because the stakes are high. They're extremely high for Ukraine, but they're also pretty high for us. Why are they so high for Ukraine? In the case of Trump, I think some people claim to know what he will do. I'm not one of them. I'm more in the radical uncertainty camp because I think there's so much uncertainty around this man. But I think we do know that there is no attachment at all to Ukraine at the individual level. He links it to it's Biden's war, it's Biden's war. And of course, it also, at a certain point, was linked to the whole Hunter Biden, Zelensky. Okay. Even beyond that, I think the man has no emotional or other connection to the Ukraine war. I think he's supremely transactional and short-term. You sometimes hear he's isolationist, and I'm not even sure if that is the best way of describing him. I think it's about a man who does deals, or think he can do deals. And notions of commitment and loyalty do not rate so highly, but doing deals appeals. But of course, everything depends on the terms of the deal. And I think it's important to note that there are huge divisions among his advisors on everything. There will be a war, if he were to win, there will be a war for Trump's ear. Yeah? Who is the last person in the room? Because he tends to agree with the last person he's spoken with. And the fact that his advisors disagree so much on the Ukraine war, as they disagree on China, as they disagree on trade, as they disagree on so many issues, is very important. And you remember the chaos of the first term, and I do expect that to be a feature of a Trump 2.0. In the case of Harris, the question is it really going to be more of the same? That's the default assumption. That's what you hear. It's going to be the same. It's going to be the same. Well, is it now? Is it now? I think also her attachment to the Ukraine issue and European security by extension is of a different quality than it is for Joe Biden. She says the right things, but she hasn't said all that much about Ukraine or NATO or EU security, or understandably perhaps, but this is something that we can't take for granted. Different to the Republican side, the Democratic side, I think, is more united on the main thrusts of Ukraine, EU, NATO. So I think that is likely to continue. But also Harris would likely have to deal with a divided Congress. That's the story that held up for so many months the supply of weapons to Ukraine, was the Congress was so divided and the Republicans were unable to. Majority leader couldn't corral the minority among Republicans to vote for the appropriations. And I do think it's wise to remind ourselves and be clear that also Harris believes, and probably believes even more than Biden, that the US has other priorities, notably China. So a bit more, if you take those thoughts a little bit forward and further, what does it then mean in terms of scenarios and what we as Europeans should do now and think? I think the main scenario of under a Trump 2.0 could be labeled perhaps, you know, accelerated abandonment, accelerated withdrawal, accelerated shifts. There is talk in Washington of a so-called dormant NATO, where you put the NATO alliance essentially in the deep freeze, and of a support for a bilateralization of security ties. And here Europeans have a choice to make, how we approach a potential Trump 2.0. Is it going to be a race to the White House to kiss the ring? Or is there going to be some sort of organized, shared approach? You know, I would like the second, but I fear the first scenario. That Europeans need to be disciplined in how they approach a Trump White House. And I think it's important that we, not just for Ukraine, but for everything, realize that there are these tribes among the Trump advisors. There's a group you may call the prioritizers, and they say Ukraine nor the Middle East, by the way. That isn't our main priority. The main priority is the strategic competition with China. That's where the future will be decided. So progressively, we should reduce our commitments in Ukraine and the Middle East. There are also the restrainers that want to reduce overall global commitments and focus on better deals for the United States. So there are these different tribes amongst the Republicans that we have to watch. On Harris, beyond Ukraine as such, I think she will likely maintain the commitment to NATO. But the long-standing American request for Europeans to shoulder a greater responsibility for their own security, that line will become even louder than it has already been, even more insistent than it has been. And it's important that she, to recognize that she will, I think, join the new Washington consensus on the threat posed by China and the technological race and everything that comes in. So what does that all mean? I think we have to recognize Biden was the last transatlanticist. A new chapter, regardless of who wins in November, is opening. Important that we also recognize that a potential crisis over Taiwan or other crisis scenarios in Asia can accelerate all these shifts that I've described. So for us, can we defend Europe with less America? That's the ultimate question. Now, what can we then do in more concrete terms for Ukraine? I think the debate will be about how we can share a greater share of the assistance. In the case American assistance goes down, can we go beyond weapon supplies? Are there other ideas out there that we need to entertain? And what will Europeans do if a political dynamic around negotiations is materializing? In particular, under a Trump scenario, imagine, he calls up Putin already in the transition phase and says, in January we're going to meet. What will Europeans then do? There's also this idea that he may say, I don't turn up to the next NATO summit unless there is a parallel negotiation with Putin and Ukraine. He links US commitment to NATO to the opening of negotiations. All these things are not excluded. I think I would take them quite seriously as scenarios. And for us, it will be very, very divisive. Because half the room in the European Union will say, never, 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 maximum support for Ukraine. And the other half will say, well, maybe. So Trump will, I think, also in that respect, pose a significant challenge. Now, Europeans, I suggest, and I've mentioned this before, we have to, for our own reason, enhance and step up and expand our support. I think, everybody knows the main priorities of air defense, F-16s, weapons production inside Ukraine, elsewhere. That whole agenda is, I think, necessary and deserves continued and expanded support. There's one additional idea I just want to throw out. In addition to all of that, so not in place of, but in addition to all of that, there's maybe one other thought that we could entertain. The problem here that we face, that we know that weapons and money alone are not enough. Ukraine needs weapons and money, but it also needs massive training. Here you have a graph on the right. The figures in blue, light blue, are the currently mobilized Ukrainian troops, presently. Then the dark blue are the additional mobilization that Ukraine has identified for this year, for 2024. And at the bottom are there are 6 puppets, 6 figures, are the troops that the European Union, to its great credit, has already trained. 60,000, I think, is roughly the figure where we are today, and it is actually ahead of schedule that we have set. If I'm not mistaken, we said we would do 60 by the end of the year, so we are good. But we are good. we're not where we need to be, or where Ukraine needs to be. The needs that Ukraine faces are enormous. Now, we do a lot of training as EU in Germany and Poland, but that's, as the other picture indicates, that's still quite far from the battlefield. So maybe an idea could be to move some of that training inside Ukraine. I know it's controversial. Member states are divided on this, but I think it's something that we will have to consider, in particular in a scenario where the US were to withdraw. It would have, have efficiency gains that are very significant. Could also be coupled with the repair and the restoration of equipment closer to the front line, all of which to enhance the capacity of Ukraine to win. Now, let me zoom out and go to the broader European security defense agenda. Barbara will say much more, but quickly, what have we done? We didn't start from zero. Christina also mentioned some of the, let's say, the progress that has already been made over the years on strategies, on experience, on operational deployments, and so on and so forth. Here you see some of these highlights. We started actually with Javi Solana many years ago in 2003 with the first CSDP missions in Africa and the Balkans. And we needed that because the European Union spent money, we have development assistance, we have sort of enlargement as a way of stabilizing countries in our neighborhood, but we lacked at the time, 20 years ago, an instrument, a way of also doing crisis management. If you want diplomacy to succeed, you need crisis management to accompany that. So there was a revolution at that stage already of the European Union. Then, you know, we had the Treaty of Lisbon, and the post of the High Representative was created. Under Federica Mogherini, the global strategy was adopted, various defense initiatives were deployed. With Josep Borrell, we started to put some money, began to put some money behind this, the European Defense Fund, the European Peace Facility, which financed this military supplies to Ukraine and other places in the world, as you'll hear in a moment. The strategic compass. I mean, I want to give you a sense that this story is old. And that's the good and the bad thing at the same time. The good thing is we don't start from zero. There are many attempts have been made at a conceptual level in terms of organization of instruments, of the machinery in Brussels. But the bad news is that the speed at which we have progressed does not keep pace with the deterioration of the security environment. And as my other mentor, Javi Solana, said, if a physicist, if the world around you changes faster than you are changing, then you are going backwards. And in relative terms, maybe that's the case. I want to say something, and then I'll stop, on the deployment side, on the missions and operations, the thousands of women and men that the European Union deploys today on 3 continents. As I mentioned, this was and remains a supremely important instrument of the European Union to exert pressure in crisis zones to solve problems, but they're also relatively small in size, and many are understaffed. And in the Sahel, we've had quite a number of setbacks. We have to be honest about that. Not only France, this is also a European problem. And you know, I think we need to reflect a bit more deeply as to what works and where do we decide to deploy, where our strategic needs are at stake, where we have a competitive advantage compared to others who are in this business, the UN, member states themselves, what have you, and above all where you have local buy-in, because unless and until other people want it as well, we cannot want it more than the countries in which we are deployed. There's more competition we have to be aware of in Africa notably. You know all about the Wagner group, which now hysterically is called the Africa Corps. I mean, it cannot get worse than that as a misnomer. But this requires us to think a little bit harder on where Europeans want to go in the world. And I suggest, and I'll stop there, maybe going forward we ought to focus more really on the European continent, where that local buy-in from local partners that is essential is greater than it is elsewhere. And you also find it easier for member states to get the resources, to get the people, the manpower that you need. Coupled with, and I think it's a growing field and where we can say with a straight face that we are honestly making very, very good progress, is the global maritime domain. A number of missions have been deployed including in recent years, including now against the Houthis. And again, Barbara will talk about that, where we can honestly say we are doing things that perhaps nobody else can do in the same way, and that again has that support. So a more focused, selective approach to EU crisis management is my final thought, and I hand it back to Christina. Thanks.
Muchas gracias, Stephen, por esta visión general.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for this global vision and for presenting this geopolitical context. And I'm really glad to see that you have been mentioning the other threats and the other visions and perspectives of other countries and regions, because sometimes I wonder if we are not always going back to the same regions from Europe or Russia, but there are also other many threats. I would like to give the floor to Barbara to see what has been doing, what the EU has been doing to reinforce the capacity on matters of safety and security.
To the High Representative for this opportunity and for the work over the past 4 years and your engagement on the file on defense. So I think actually Stephen has already set a bit the political scene and explained a bit the strategic imperative of why we need to strengthen the EU defense. Now what I would do on my side, I would focus a bit more on the mechanics, on what are we actually doing. When we talk about strengthening EU defense, what do we actually mean? So where we are on EU defense, and also what next. What I bring modestly on my side is just the experience of having been really working on all these initiatives and all these ideas in the last 4 years with the 5 years with the High Representative, but also before. And having seen this, let's say, over the last 10 years, of course I will look this with a critical look, but at the same time also it's important to see where we are coming from. It's true, Stephen was saying we're not starting from scratch, but I think if we look, we were discussing yesterday with some of the participants, like 10 years ago, no one was following defense. If defense was on the agenda of the European Council, it was once every 2-3 years. Now it's at the top of the political agenda. It is basically on every single meeting of EU leaders, security and defense is on the agenda. So there has been a change, and we need to acknowledge that as well. So I throw this at you just to start. As you know, the European Union loves acronyms, and you will realize that especially in the field of security and defense, even more so. So you may have heard all these initiatives, PESCO, CDP, CARD, EDIRPA, EDIS, EDIP. So my objective for today is to actually convince you and prove to you that in reality all these initiatives, and Stephen was also referring a plethora of strategies and initiatives, there is a logic behind. There is a vision behind. And what you see in the middle, the strategic compass, is actually what has given the vision of EU defense and actually an action plan to strengthen the EU defense. And you will see how all these pieces eventually fits in one clear plan and vision. So I will not go into how the world has changed, because I think this was discussed also over the past few days, and Stephen has covered that extensively. I find just interesting to look at how the perception of the world has evolved in the EU strategies. So Stephen mentioned European security strategy in 2003. The opening sentence was, "Europe has never been so safe." Then in 2016, with the EU Global Strategy, we started to realize that perhaps we live in a more contested and complex world. And then we get to 2022, and that's when the High Representative presented the strategic compass, and he said very clearly, Europe is in danger. And that was actually even before Russia's invasion to Ukraine, and then the strategic compass was adopted in March 2022, so it was just a few weeks after Russia started the invasion, the aggression against Ukraine, and so the compass was adopted by the 27 member states, because that's also what makes the compass special, that there is really the political weight of the 27 member states behind, and it was adopted when we were witnessing the return of war in Europe. And it's clear that Russia's war of aggression has been a turning point for EU defense. I mean, we were doing things before, but now it's different. Call it Zeitenwende, call it tectonic shift, whatever, but it has made a change on the way the EU does security and defense. So we get now to the strategic compass. What is it when we talk about EU defense? So here are basically the main building blocks of EU defense. Let's say it's about ACT, so our operational engagement, missions and operation. It's about invest, so what we do to develop defense capabilities. It's about secure in terms of building the resilience and securing access to strategic domains, cyber, outer space, or maritime. And it's about, of course, partner. And these dimensions actually are all interlinked. To act, you need to invest in defense capabilities. To secure a maritime domain, you need to act and deploy missions or operation. And across all these dimensions, actually, you need to work with partners. So for the sake of the presentation, I would focus more, I would say, a bit on the act part and the operational engagement, but I would focus then mostly on the invest, because this is really what is now at the core of the debate on EU defense. And if I have time, just very briefly on the other dimension, because I will focus also on what is coming next. So starting with the act. So all it's about the EU as a more credible defense actor. And one way we have, the one means that we have is our CSDP missions and operations. Stephen was referring already that here you have all of them deployed across the continents. I'm not going to enter into all of them, but just to highlight a few, especially the most recent one. Well, UMAM Ukraine, Stephen mentioned already, almost 60,000 Ukrainian soldiers trained. This is the biggest training endeavor of the European Union on EU soil. And we are now in the process of reviewing also the mission, what we call the strategic review, precisely to see how we can use this mission to better fit the evolving needs of Ukraine. UNAFOR Aspides, this is one of the most recent naval operations. You were talking about maritime engagement as a maritime security provider, very concrete EU ships escorting merchant vessels to protect them from Houthis attack in the Red Sea. Over 200 ships protected so far. This is one of the most dangerous actually mission that the EU is currently undertaking. Then I'm not shying away from the Sahel region, where we also need to admit that we have experienced challenges. So some of the missions actually are no longer there, but we are also trying to go for a new kind of engagement. This is the Security and Defense Initiative in the Gulf of Guinea. We are trying to go for a lighter approach, a smaller footprint, but trying to develop something that is better tailored to the needs of the partners, and combining this also with the support through the European Peace Facility, which I will come to in a minute. And then also on the civilian side, of course, the latest mission in Armenia or Moldova, which is the first mission of its kind, also supporting Moldova to address cyber and hybrid threats. When it comes to the EU as a global defense actor. Here, the European Peace Facility has been really one of the game changer. For those who do not know, very briefly, this is an off-budget fund that finances two things: the military missions and operations, and provides military support to partners across the world. Now, I had the privilege to follow all the discussions since the very, very beginning when this initiative started, and this was much earlier than it was actually established. And at that time, we were recalling with Stephen, we were discussing how can we provide boots to the Somali soldiers that we were training. They were going to training with flip-flops, and we wanted to provide boots. And we did not have a tool in the EU to do so, because the EU budget could not fund things that were linked to military, and we were thinking, but it's military linked to development, so there was an initiative, for those who remember, all about that, and that's where we realized we need a tool to support, to provide military support. But that was the kind of mindset. It was about train and equip. So how can we give equipment to those that we train? And now we are in a completely different situation, and the European facility, as Stephen said, has been a game changer in the context of Russia's war of aggression to Ukraine. No one, when we were discussing all this, no one could have imagined, of course, that Russia would have invaded Ukraine, but even less so that we would ever provide lethal weapons to a country at war. Already the discussion on lethal was quite controversial, even internally, but that's what we are doing now. I'm not going too much into the details of military support to Ukraine, because we are having also a session this afternoon, but here you have the figures. Ukraine Assistance Fund, 5 billion, 6.1 billion already given, 1.4 billion from the windfall profits from the Russian frozen assets. This is the more recent development to provide Ukraine with air defense, ammunition, and support also their industry. But of course, the European Peace Facility has a global scope, so with over 20 partners have been supported so far, and the success of this initiative is linked to, when it was adopted with 5.7 billion, and now we have a facility with 17 billion. Very briefly, just because it is one of the initiatives also under the compass and under the dimension of a global actor, the rapid deployment capacity, the initiative to have a force or a capacity up to 5,000 troops that could be deployed to quickly respond to crises, build on the battle groups, but here we are also doing developments. Last year, here in Spain, in Cadiz, the European Union carried out the first ever military live exercise. We had never done before. And so it is one step forward, and we are aiming to have this capacity fully operational by 2025. Now, of course, we can look at all this at our operational engagement with the board, a bit more of a critical look, but Stephen was doing this already a bit. It's true that we are working in more complex and hostile theaters with more competition, the issue of local ownership of resources, the way we define the end state of our mission. Sometimes it's really mission impossible, which becomes difficult then to leave. What we are doing to address this, we are trying to develop mission mandates that could be better tailored to the needs of the partners. I mentioned the initiative in the Gulf of Guinea, trying to have faster deployments and decision-making. The issue of personnel, assets, and funding, of course, remains. But we are also trying to develop more effective command and control structures, bearing in mind that CSDP missions are always only one element that needs to be part of a more strategic approach. I would move now to invest, which is really the core of the presentation, and here we start with the figures. And here you have the EU defense spending. What you see there in green, it's a curve that goes down and now is rapidly going up. So the EU defense expenditure in 2024 is expected to be over 330 billion. 30% increased compared to the pre-war level of 2021, and we are expected this year to reach the 1.9% of the GDP, which is really something so far. Before we were at 1.5 and now 1.9, so getting closer to the 2%. The dotted line is where we were supposed to be if we had spent actually the 2%.
Just one question for everyone to understand. This is the aggregate of all the countries' expenditure. It's not the EU budget.
No. Exactly. It's EU member states' defense, collective defense expenditure. Absolutely. If we then look at the investment, investment is basically the part of the spending that actually goes into equipment. And here you see the curve, again, EU member states collective. You see the curve going even steeper with an expectation of 100 billion in 2024, 70% increased compared to 2021, and we would reach the 31% of the defense expenditure. So here it's one of the cases where we actually exceed the benchmark that we set for ourselves. It was 20% and we are now at 31%. So all this is good. EU member states are collectively spending more, but, and there is the but, still too little in cooperation. If we look at the equipment procurement, the collective equipment procurement, we are at 18%. Only 18% is procured in cooperation, and we are still far below what was the agreed benchmark of 35%. So what this leave us to? These are the challenges that we need to address when it comes to defense investment. These are not new. We knew about this before, but clearly Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine had really exposed them even further and made it even more evident and more pressing the need to address them. So member states still lack critical capabilities due to the decades of underinvestment. The European defense industry is not producing fast enough and in the quantities that we need. And here the ammunition is obviously a case in point. There is still lack of coordination, what we were saying before. Member states do not cooperate enough in developing and acquiring armaments. And this will lead also to dependencies. Since the start of the war until last summer, basically 78%, almost 80% of what the member states bought was imported from outside the EU, and 63% from the US. And we also lag behind on innovation. Only 1.5% of the defense spending goes to research and technology, and this will be an important dimension, especially for the future. So what is now coming to the EU defense cooperation logic, so making the case for EU defense cooperation, why we need to cooperate. If member states develop and procure the capabilities together, we have first more efficiency, economies of scale. We have less fragmentation. You may have seen or heard, we always say in the US they have one type of battle tank, in the EU we have 17. So fragmentation. And fragmentation brings a problem of interoperability, obviously. But if we cooperate, we would have more interoperability. We would have more ambition and innovation, because of course there are projects that one member state alone cannot do. If they get together, they can do something more ambitious. And also when it comes to innovation and exchange. And procuring together also would give more predictability to the defense industries. So this translates into stronger EU defense industry, stronger EU defense, and stronger NATO. I don't know if I'll have time to address this, but I'm sure we'll come back also to that. So the question is, what are we doing? What, as European Union, how can we support? So first, we can identify together the common priorities in terms of capability development. And here we have the European Defence Agency that does that, together with the member states. Now we start seeing a bit those tools that I told you at the beginning through the capability development plan. Basically, the agency, we have a European Defence Agency, sits with member states, and together they identify what are the key capability that we need to develop to address current and future threats. And we do this through the capability development plan. Second, we can get at EU level an overview of what is the EU defense landscape and where are opportunities for cooperation. And this is, again, the European Defense Agency that does that through the coordinated annual review on defense. They have bilateral dialogues. They sit with all member states to see who is planning to invest in what, and based on that, they identify opportunities for cooperation. We will have the next, we are working on this right now, and we will have the next CARD report in November. Third thing, we can offer as EU frameworks for getting together and cooperate. And here it's PESCO. You may have heard of this, Permanent Structured Cooperation comes in. So PESCO is a framework that allows member states to get together and do projects together. It could be for defense research, it could be for capability development, it could be for acquisition, joint acquisitions. We have now 68 PESCO projects. Of course, here, what kind of project, how relevant, this is something that we will need to discuss, and there is now ongoing what we call a strategic review of PESCO, precisely to see where we can go for the next phase. And then finally, we come to the money side. So the financial incentives from the EU budget and also regulatory measures. And these are where the commissions come in with the industrial dimension. And here we have the European Defence Fund to fund industries, to do defense research, and to do capability development up to the prototype. I will give you a few figures and keep in mind. So European Defence Fund is 8 billion for the years 2021-2027. So this is EU budget. Then we have the Act in Support of Ammunition Production and the EUROPA, the European Defence Industry Reinforcement Through Procurement Act. This is a difficult one. These two instruments have been created really in reaction to Russia's war of aggression to basically address the urgent need of ramping up the production of ammunition, so the ASAP, 500 million, and the second one is to incentivize joint procurement, 300 million. And then the latest one is EDIP, the European Defence Industry Programme. This is still a proposal of the Commission, so it's still being discussed by the co-legislator with 1.5 billion. Yes, 1.5 billion. And this is a more complex proposal, but basically keeps again takes the logic of the ASAP and the EUROPA and to bring it more for the expanding beyond ammunition and missiles or the most urgent. So if we see the same, so we have identification of priorities, collaborative opportunities, project, and defense capabilities, we see how basically we have the two logic interacting. And this is an important element. You have the demand side and you have the supply. So on the demand side, there is the intergovernmental logic, so member states, here the European Defence Agency plays a key role in identifying the priorities and the project. And then comes the supply. So the industrial dimension, the community method, the supranational, and all this initiative with the EU budget to support the European defense industry. And these two, the key is really to link the two. The supply needs to match the demand. When we talk about the European defense industry, we need to keep in mind that it's not any other industry. Defense industry is special because the only buyers are governments. And the governments and the national army are the end users and those who decide which capability we need to focus on. A couple of examples just to explain this link between the intergovernmental, the CSDP, and the industrial instrument. A PESCO project, European Patrol Corvette. It's about developing a new class of military ship. This is a PESCO project that responds to a priority identified in the capability development plan and of collaborative opportunities identified by the coordinated annual review on defense. And here comes the funding, the EU budgetary funding from the European Defence Fund, 2 grants. And because it's a PESCO project, they get a PESCO bonus. And the funding goes to an industrial consortium coordinated by Naviris with the defense agency supporting the implementation. So here you have all these instruments and all the elements and the actors coming together in support of one project. A second example, the ammunition initiative. Here again, you have the demand side and the supply side coming together. On the demand side, the European Defence Agency has signed framework contracts for joint procurement of ammunition, and the European Peace Facility was supporting. On the supply side, the Commission is financing industries to ramp up industrial production capacity through the Act in Support of Ammunition Production. So again, the logic of demand and supply. And this is really the logic behind the European Defence Industrial Strategy that was presented last March. The idea is to move from the emergency response, so what we have been doing in reaction immediately to the Russia's war of aggression, the need for ammunition and more urgent defense projects, and translate this into a long-term approach. So it's about investing more, better, together, and European. We also set new targets, so that we want to set achieve 40% of defense equipment procured collaboratively by 2030, and 50% from the European defense industry. Remember, before we were saying 18% so far in terms of collaborative procurement, and we were buying from outside Europe 80%. So there is some work to do. These are ambitious targets, and the strategy is supported by this program, defense industry program, with regulatory measure and with the 1.5 billion. It's true that Stephen mentioned here an important dimension of the European defense industrial strategy. It's also bringing in the Ukrainian defense industry. So starting the integration of the Ukrainian defense industrial base into the European one. Basically treating Ukraine already as a quasi-member state. So I will now, in the interest of time, just skip the other two parts, maybe just one word on the secure and this dimension to explain a bit how defense actually goes also beyond military and defense capability. We have seen how the defense and the concept of defense has been broadening. I think you were referring also to that. It's linked to many other policies. It's also about, yesterday we were discussing economic security, how defense relates to artificial intelligence, to cyber, to hybrid, outer space, and really in particular on hybrid and cyber threats, because they were not mentioned. I just want to mention, you have read in the news about GPS signal jamming over the Baltic state, or sabotages, or arson attacks. I mean, the news were full of this, or instrumentalization of migrants. So this is another growing dimension. It's not necessarily purely military, but it is growing. And if on the one hand with the Russian invasion of Ukraine we have seen the return of conventional warfare, on the other hand we have also seen an increase in terms of hybrid campaign. Partner, Stephen covered already with the Transatlantic and NATO, maybe we can come back to that, but I want to move now at the looking ahead. The context, again, you know very well, Russia's war of aggression continue, growing instability in the neighborhood and beyond, uncertainty about the outcome of the US election, rising hybrid threats. So what do we need to focus on? And here is the buzzword now, is defense readiness. We need to be defense ready. And this means investing more on the capabilities that we lack now, but also in the future. So the element of defense innovation, and a stronger and more responsive European defense industry. This is also reflected, we are now at the start of the new institutional cycle, so this is also reflected in the strategic agenda that was approved by the leaders in June, and also in the political guidelines for the next commission that were presented by the president of the commission to the parliament in July, where she mentioned the white paper on the future of defense, working towards a single market for defense, and this new also concept of the defense project of common interest. This also comes with the European defense industrial strategy. Basically, how can we focus on projects that one member state alone cannot do, but we can do it at EU level, and we, as European Union, can incentivize member states getting together. The air shield is one of the proposals that's been floated around. Now, and here I close, but I do think this is important. What do we need? What are the key conditions to really make advances on this? I say coherence, funding, and political will. When I say coherence, I mean what I was saying before, linking all the policies and the initiatives, and having all the EU actors working together, be the European Defence Agency, the Commission. We have so many tools and policies now developed. We need to link them. And this applies to the defense industry versus intergovernmental CSDP side, but also applies when we're talking about cyber hybrid. I mean, our adversaries are using different techniques and linking different methods, and we need to do the same. And we have policies and tools that we can mobilize. Second is funding, and this is really now the key. I was mentioning various figures, the 1.5 billion, the 500 million. Now, this is what we are talking about for now in terms of EU budget. Now, it has been estimated, on the other hand, it has been estimated that if we had invested the 2% since 2006, I think, and then invested 20% as the benchmarking in defense, we would have had additional over 400 billion in the last years. So just to give you the sense of the magnitude, of course, it's not that the EU budget would cover. Of course, it's for the member states to increase, as they are doing, their defense spending. but we do need the funding, and this will make the difference, and this is indeed what is now really at the core of the debate. There is a tasking to the Commission and to the High Representative by the European Council to develop options for access to private and public financing to defense industry. So it's true, it's not only public, it's also private. So we're looking also at the European Investment Bank. There have been some positive development lately. But this will be now the key issue that will be discussed and will be on the agenda in the coming months and years, because it's now, but it's also for the future, and relatively soon. I mean, there will be discussion starting on the next multi-annual financial framework, the next MFF 28-2035, and there again we will see how much money we put behind this initiative and behind our ambition on strengthening European defense industry. And then, of course, the political will and the member states buy in. Without that, we are not going anywhere. In terms of political commitment and council conclusion, we are there, but of course, then there is always a bit of a gap between what we say and then we do. So this will be, we will see how things will develop in the coming months and years. And I think I will stop here. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Bárbara, por traer un poco de luz a esta sopa de letras
Thank you, Barbara, to bring about this talk. And I have two questions related to what you have told us and related to the last point. The first question, what about the intelligence? Because before the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, we have seen as the US intelligence was saying that the troops were concentrating, and also the British intelligence that was there as well, although lagging behind. But one of the worst thing is the coordination among the members. And linked to that, and the last point about the political will, how are we doing in matters of narrative in the integration? European integration is sovereignty. But if the euro means leaving out a degree of sovereignty, the foreign policy is a policy that is a part of the states, although we try to coordinate, and we have done many progress, a lot of progress, but the defense is also means leaving out some of our sovereignty. These matters are quite complex, but please go ahead.
Yes. No, on the intelligence, indeed, that's a key point. Of course, as European Union, we do not have the intelligence. We rely on the intelligence of the member states. We do have what we call another acronym, SIAC, so the Single Intelligence Analysis Capacity, and we have an INSEN, an intelligence center within the European External Action Service. But that relies on the intelligence that comes from the member states. What is interesting is that I didn't mention, but they do play a key role also in what we say in terms of building a common strategic culture. And again, going back to the compass, before the compass, that was quite a long process. It was precisely this single intelligence analysis capacity that engaged all the intelligence of the member states to come up with a threat analysis. So our policy on defense is based, and the compass builds on this threat analysis, so done together with all the intelligence of the member states. And the INSEN and SIAC will play a key role also in the implementation of many of this initiative. I didn't enter into the details when it comes to the hybrid and cyber, but there again, we do need, if we want to understand the threat and anticipate the threat, we do need that. We do have a hybrid fusion cell, but ultimately it's about what comes from the member states. And on the other question, which is even more complex, yes, as you said yourself, the defense is indeed, I mean, it's the core of sovereignty. So it's not easy to give away sovereignty. And we see this, and this is why the whole process, since it started, it was not easy. But the point here is now that we need to realize what is the environment around us and the fact that alone member states cannot tackle certain challenges, and that the security of one is really linked to the security on the other. So of course, on the one hand, everyone wants to protect, we're talking about vulnerabilities, we're talking about things that each member state wants to keep for yourself, but at the same time, we need to find, basically, I think the key is to find the added value and the incentive for the member states to give it away because they gain something more. And that's a bit the whole logic, to explain the logic why we need to do defense cooperation. But obviously, it's not easy.
Muchas gracias. Antes de pasar.
Thank you so much. Before giving the floor to the High Representative, I also have a question for Stephen. As a part of your presentation has to do with coordination with NATO as a pillar for European defense, and with this sentence of, are we going to be able to defend ourselves with less America? I'm here as a moderator, but in my view, it's unavoidable to go to that less America, not only because of the situation nowadays regarding budget and the reality in which we live, where we have a possibility of Trump being there once again, but as you've mentioned, the priorities of the U.S. are elsewhere. Right now, there's a concentration of interest in Ukraine, in Eastern Europe, but in fact their priority is China, Asia Pacific, and that's what they're focused on. So how do we understand that in Europe? And later on, I have a question for the High Representative that is linked to this. Are we really, or we really want to have a geopolitical role? Are we working on this? I know this is a big leap to what we had before, but we have to ask ourselves, can we have a defense with less America? Of course. Do we want to take that path or not?
Thank you very much, Christina, for that question. Allow me to share another little story of your other question you put to Barbara, because I think it may help to advance our thinking on the sovereignty question, right? Indeed, what we're discussing now is a hypersensitive domain that is traditionally defined as core of national sovereignty, and that's why it has been relatively challenging to make the progress that we have been pushing for together in recent years. But it's also to do, in my view, sometimes about the definition of sovereignty. What does sovereignty mean? And in this sense, there's a phrase by the, unfortunately, it's a British politician, but it's a good phrase. It's Heseltine, he said, "A man alone in the desert is sovereign. He's also powerless." So this is a little bit true. Yes, you can fetishize sovereignty and to cling to the absolute purity of veto powers and intergovernmentalism and what have you. But there's a price to pay for that. And this, I think, is also a little bit the dilemma, perhaps, that high representatives, plurals, sometimes struggle with, that they know very well that it's a member state-owned, member state-driven. Barbara repeated several times, and she is right. It has to be driven, owned by member states, and at the same time, it is also true, and you see sometimes that member states find it difficult to go beyond a certain industrial national logic when it comes to armaments decisions. If you purely keep everything by unanimity, one is enough among 27 to block progress. And we've been blocked for months now on the European Peace Facility because of a blockage by one member state, and I think everybody knows which one. So this, for me, as a European, profoundly European, this is the dilemma that I know this is a field that is intergovernmental for those historical reasons, but we need to make progress. And we cannot be paralyzed because the cost of paralysis is enormous, as given everything that we've been talking about. All these problems are getting worse and worse and worse and worse. We spoke about that, and there is a little bridge now to your specific question on Trump and are we ready for less America under any scenario? Because it was a little bit my message indeed, that also under Harris, I think we should mentally politically prepare ourselves for doing that, because I think there are deep trends inside the US political system that will drive its increased focus on the wider Indo-Pacific and China in particular. And I wouldn't say Europe alone, but I would say Europe should prepare itself for those kinds of scenarios and accept the consequences that come from that. Because it's also true in some respects, we've been, some of us, not everybody, but some of us have been quite happy to be under the US umbrella and to outsource this whole issue to the United States, and then criticized for the manner in which the US conducted itself. It was sometimes also in psychological terms not a bad deal, and that deal is gone. I would suggest to you. So with that come also the difficult dilemmas, where you spend your money, how you spend your money, do we spend it enough? I very much echo what Barbara said, having followed it not as closely as she has, but maybe for longer than she has, this debate. Unless and until there is money behind it, the game will not change. The game will not change. So these are very tough political discussion, but I think the job is for analysts and for think tankers is to animate these political discussions with facts, with analysis, and then hopefully collectively we can move forward in that. But for the US, I think the term is regardless of who wins in November, we have to do all of this, regardless. Thanks.
Ahora, eso enlaza también, yo antes mencionaba.
This is also linked because I talked about the role of the public in general, and if they support reinforcing defense capacities and supporting Ukraine. But this is also very much linked, and I would like to address you now, High Representative, with a role as a geopolitical power in the world. Because we always say in Europe that we don't want to be trapped between choosing between a divided world into blocks. And of course, we know who is a priority partner, our main partner, but still we don't want to have to choose. And that's why we can participate, or we should participate in the definition of that new global order. And now, High Representative, I want to remind everyone that a year after you started being High Representative and before Russia attacked Ukraine, you said something that we will always remember and that has been repeated over and over, and that is that the EU had to learn how to speak the language of power. And I wanted to know if we are really learning, if we're moving in the right direction, what's the kind of Europe that we want as a geopolitical agent. And another more specific question that is linked to what Barbara just explained, that is, in your view, what do you believe is the role, or how do you see the idea of the President of the Commission of creating or having a Commissioner for Defense? Do you think this will be helpful to develop capabilities, or will it just increase the bureaucracy? One of the things we always criticize of Brussels. You've seen how complex all this is, and we have to thank Barbara for the enormous effort made to show in just a few slides something that the majority of people in Brussels still don't understand. So it's not that the audience in general, but even myself, I asked Barbara, what does this exactly mean? And this complexity is unavoidable because, as we've been seeing in these days, the Union has a pillar of states and then a community pillar. And treaties have put defense on the states pillar. Defense, according to the treaties, is a national power. National security is in the power of the hands of the member states. So a commissioner for defense would be a contradiction in itself, because the Commission has no competence or power in strictly speaking of defense, because defense in fact is a polymorphic term, and under this term we can find many elements. Maybe it would have been more adequate to call him the Commissioner for the Industry of Defense, which is what we have powers on as Commission, because the defense industry is an industrial sector and is part of the industry, and the industry manufacturing goods of one type or another, and there is an industrial sector. An industrial sector manufacturing goods for defense. But one thing is the defense industry, and something else is defense. When we talk about defense, we think about armies, for example. From the doctrine to deployment. So we have the doctrine, the type of armies that we want to have, to the practical deployment on the field of these armies. So the Commission has no competences. The competences are of the member states. So therefore, denominating him or her a commissioner for defense will create interinstitutional confusion. And as the former director for legal services of the European Council said, Mr. Pires, he said if someone knows well the treaties, it's himself, because he was one of them persons drafting them. And he said, in reality, we already have a commissioner for defense, and that is the vice president of the Commission that is in charge of coordinating the foreign policies that right now is myself. So we already have one person, the Vice President of the Commission, that also has the cap of not only High Representative for Foreign Affairs, but also for security. And security policy includes defense policy. Tomorrow, we will have a gentleman that will be a defense commissioner and someone else that would be vice president of the Commission and at the same time in charge of security and defense policies of the Council. So the confusion and the interinstitutional conflict, even if there is goodwill, is present. And that won't be helpful. I believe we need to respect the powers given in the treaty to the institutions. The Commission has its powers in defense industry, no doubt, and is exercising this power, and I think it has to be so. We can also think that it has powers regarding military transport, because transport is also something that is used. And the paradox in Europe is that many of our infrastructures are not thought of for military transport, and there are bridges that couldn't support the weight of a tank, or tunnels that don't have enough height, or roads that don't have the width or the resistance for heavy load military vehicles. But we have to also be aware that cybersecurity also has a defense component, and that we need to prepare European society, not only armies, but European society, as the societies that are exposed to war are doing. For example, the Finnish, that have a tradition of being prepared for a war conflict when civil resources are mobilized and citizens know what they have to do. And the whole society is prepared in case that we hope never happens, but that is possible, of then having to face a military conflict. So bringing all this together under one commissioner that is in charge of what we call in a broad term defense, could be useful, but we should avoid all interinstitutional conflicts and know clearly who is doing what. Because in this political term, there has been an enlargement of the activity in the security and defense, and there's going to be even more in the next. But it's important to know who has the responsibilities, and it's not enough to just grow in someone else's space. And the Council and the Commission have to understand each other, which is key for interinstitutional operation. In Europe, we waste a lot of time in coordinating ourselves between states that have to decide unanimously, between the Commission and the Council, with the Parliament. Decisions take too long to be made, and all of them are always an interinstitutional negotiation that sometimes ends up in the courts. As with any complex political structure, when there's different levels of power, different pillars, there's overlapping of functions and activities. And in the Commission, and thanks to Commissioner Breton, whom I want to acknowledge for everything he's done in development all these instruments, has progressed in providing support to the defense industry, because as Barbara explained, since the Euro crisis in Europe, we've gone through a very slow and silent and ongoing process of disarmament. And the figures were very clear. We've invested less and less in defense. Many of the industries were reduced or even closed because there was no demand. And the defense industry market is very specific market because fortunately it only has one customer, which is the state. Fortunately, I say, because if we lived in a situation more similar to the US, where people just go and buy any kind of guns and ammunition, then if people would go and buy bazookas, you would have more customers. But we want in defense to only have one customer, and that to be the government to buy these weapons for the army and the police. And when we talk about tanks, airplanes, all the heavy vehicles and the enormous technological capacity of modern defense, there's only one customer. If that customer is not so much present in the market because it has other priorities, then the industry focuses on something different too. And when we have a war, suddenly we realize that we are not prepared to face this war. It's not a war because we are not fighting it, fortunately, and we don't foresee this happening. But if you want to supply ammunition to a country in war, a country where there's a high-intensity war, this has to come from the stock that you already have, or you manufacture it. So that's what the European armies have done. They've taken this ammunition from their warehouses, from the already existing stock. And I was the one that said we have to use the material inherited from the Soviet era that we had from the Warsaw Agreement times, because this is what the Ukrainians know how to use. It's easier for a Ukrainian pilot to pilot a MiG than an F-16 because they are more used to this. And this is true for everything from the calibers to the handling of a vehicle. And we first started with stocks that still remained in countries like Poland. These are the what we send to them first. But then there's no more stock, and the armies want to maintain a minimum level of stock. just in case something happens. You cannot be left unprotected. And then the industry starts to manufacture. But to manufacture, you need machines, raw materials, production lines, and manpower. It's not as easy. When we said to Ukraine, and this was an initiative of the First Minister in Estonia that will be the next High Representative. We need this caliber, which is the standard caliber for the artillery in this area. It's the standard, but then there's many 155. And I've had to learn this because I had to do a quick master's on weapons. And when we don't have it, we need to manufacture it, and we start to manufacture it, and the industry asks for support, and they say, you want me to manufacture, but who's going to purchase this? Because I have to invest, and I want to, of course, to be a profitable business. And that's why we started with these programs to provide support to the industry. And we weren't able to give them 1 million projectiles of 155. We only did half of those, even though these figures are not very trustworthy because not everyone knows everything. And probably there's been supplies that have gone to Ukraine that we are not aware of. But with a high-intensity war where more than 10,000 ammo is used per day, we don't have enough stock now. We're producing more. We will continue producing more and increasing the amounts. And the commissioner in charge of the industry and of the internal market, Commissioner Breton, has done a great job. And probably him and myself were more optimistic than we should have regarding the increased pace for production. But it's increased very quickly, not sufficiently enough, but quite quickly. And now we are going to a different stage in which the industry has to be able to supply jointly different states at the same time, what we call joint procurement. And Barbara has explained this. We are doing quite bad on joint procurement, and 18%, less than 20%. We've set an objective of a 30%. In Europe, as I said one day, we're very good at setting objectives. We don't know if we've reached the previous one, and we decide to set a more ambitious one. And it's always good to have ambition, but you have to get there. And the defense industry is fragmented because Europe is fragmented politically. The U.S. has the Pentagon. They have a Center for Public Procurement for Defense. And for the U.S., that this industry is in Miami or Minnesota or California is something they don't really care about because it's a state. But in Europe, for it to be in one state or another is not the same for the other member states because the defense industry is part of their military capacity. And for it to be common, involves specific risks and means overcoming inertias, which is very important. And these inertias are much bigger when we think about the European army or an European army, a European army, because who would lead this army to start with? Because first of all, in an army, you need to know who is the head, who will lead politically this army at the service of what? Forget about it. Well, you don't have to forget about it, but let's set ourselves realistic objectives on the short term, which is more than enough. Let's try and do what we ask ourselves to do with the strategic compass, to react quickly, to have a force to react quickly. And we don't even call it a force, we call it a capacity. Let's have the capacity of together mobilize different European armies to be able to carry out a mission like taking people from an airport in a country in crisis when we had to rescue them from Sudan. I would have loved to have this action capacity, but we didn't have it. And it was the French that went on the one hand, the German, the Spanish, the Italians. We all offered, of course, space to others in our airplanes, but there was no joint operation with European control and European means. And since the Petersburg emissions, I don't know, that's very long ago, we've said that Europe should have a capacity to react and to use this in case of emergency when you want to take people out of a country in a situation of crisis. So we've talked about it, but we haven't implemented it. And this is one of the great tasks for my successor, and I hope she can invest all her energies in a coordinated manner with other institutions. And if there is a commissioner for defense, let's say this lady or gentleman will have to work according to what the vice president in charge of defense and security policy says. If not, we will have 2 action lines as we have nowadays. Let's be honest. We have PESCO, and Barbara has explained this. It selects joint projects in defense so that member states work together instead of each on their own. We have the case of the PESCO projects that don't receive direct funding because there is no money to say, come, I'm going to fund this project from the permanent structured cooperation. Then we have the European fund that more or less does the same. It selects projects and funds to the prototype level. And here we do have funds and resources. So we need to make both things go hand in hand as much as possible, and they have interlinks. For example, PESCO projects have a premium when being funded by the European Defence Fund, but this doesn't mean that there is a group of experts in an area in the Commission that is doing something that is very similar to what other experts are doing in another area of the Council in the Defence Agency. Is there going to be money allocated to defense in the European budget? Up till now, the European budget, the consensus was for the no expenditure in defense, and military expenses could not be financed by the European budget. This was the consensus, and that's why we created the facility, that body or that instrument that is not a part of the European budget. No. The European budget is passed by the Parliament and controlled by the court. The European Peace Facility Fund is not approved by the Parliament, and the court has no jurisdiction, nor the MPs. It's an intergovernmental fund. The member states decided one day that they will put the money together, and with this money they would do things. And of course, it wasn't thought that with this money we were going to provide arms to a country that was next to Europe. It was thought to purchase boots for soldiers in Somalia, for example. I've been in training centers in the sub-Saharan Africa where we trained, because we're not present anymore, because we don't have any presence in all sub-Saharan Africa anymore, where we would train in the past the troops of the governments of the states. And when they came, they needed to bring their ammunition with them. If they didn't bring it, we could teach them to shoot with no ammunition, which doesn't make any sense at all, which is absurd. And then we decided, let's have this fund, let's put our money together in the piggy bank to help those countries with whom we cooperate at a military level. And that's why the European Peace Facility was created with 5 billion, and now we're in 17 billion because our war started, and we said, why not use this facility to purchase the weapons for Ukraine, and that's what we did. And I was going to say it's what we do, but right now there is a country that is blocking the use of these funds. And in the intergovernment area, There is a unanimity principle, and when we say that member states decide to put their money together in this piggy bank, and the way in which they use this money has to have the yes of everyone, and if one says no for this, then we don't use it, and that is the problem of the intergovernmental dimension. The advantage of the community vision is that it doesn't demand a unanimity in the operations. It really requires the agreement of the Parliament and the Council when they draft the legislative projects, and there's some that still have to be approved. The last one, what's the acronym for the last one? This is a program that still hasn't been approved.
Who is going to approve that? The Council and the Parliament. The Commission puts forward a proposal, and then both authorities have to agree upon this topic. The Parliament has to agree, and it's not the case. Currently, we are. It is 1.5 billions, American billions, or not ours, and they're going to do that. But I've heard the heads of state have said, no, I'm not going to accept these to fund that. I'm not going to be willing to put money to rearm the neighbor. So this is the great major issue. Are we going to say yes to the European budget to fund arms? We have said no for the time being. Do the legal staff say, well, yes, we can. It's possible. Again, yes, it is possible. What are going to be the consequences? Who's going to pay? What is going to be used for a common project, I guess. But the defense common project is what is mentioned into PESCO and into the European Defense Fund. But the Parliament and the Council haven't agreed. Europe is not a state. Don't forget. The U.S. are a federal state. They have what we call Pentagon, and they have only one program in defense matters, and has a major capacity in this respect. They know where are the different capacities of facilities in the States. We are not the United States. And when we see these weaknesses is when we are dealing with defense. Defense is a weakness for us because we are tired of repeating that, of course, the U.S. has only 2 types of tanks, and we have 25 different types. And, of course, it would be better to have only 2 types of tanks. But a head of state told me, what are these tanks? We have seen that many times. Please have less tanks and more coordination. Well, it is not easy. So we haven't got a Pentagon. And what would be counterproductive is to try to create these the margin of the treaties, because it wouldn't work. So the European citizens have to understand that when they think about Europe, this Europe we have today hasn't got the capacities it should have, because no one has given Europe those capacities. So we are doing what we can within the treaties to find new tracks, because to reshuffle or change the treaty is not an easy thing. The treaties have its limitations about the competences of the institutions. These are limitations. The Commission is going to enter in matters of defense through the competences of the single market, through the industrial advantages. These articles are used to get to defense, but this is quite far from being the defense. This is going to be the defense industry, and not all the defense industry, because the ones who have these capacities are the member states. What is important here, what the industry produces or what the army needs? Each state knows what its own member state needs, but altogether, it's very complex. We have in Libya war, we did not have a refueling capacity to have fuel for the aircraft. We still don't have that. We spent all our munitions in that war, so we had to call the states to help. So it is a bit the same now. We have no more stocks. So we have to have a recomposition of the stocks, increase of the industrial capacity to coordinate what the army needs and how we can meet those needs. Barbara has been quite clear. The card. What is a card? Coordinated annual review of defense. And the capability development plans. This is we are full of acronyms, sorry, but this is the capability development plan. Coordinated annual review on defense. What is that? We have to see what we have each year to see what we lack or what we need and what we have in surplus to try to diminish redundancies and suppress gaps. I've been at the forefront of that. It is not an easy task. It is something we have to do every day. That's why we have in Brussels more than 200 officials of all the armies that are coordinating the different missions we have across the world and that are going to discuss among armies to see how they can work in the most efficient way. This is only possible. This is only done by the member states. The Commission cannot do that. The Commission hasn't got the competences for that, and it would be of no use to multiply all these resources. So this is the institutional discussion that we will have in the future, how many funds they want to be devoted to army and defense. Do they need an intergovernmental instrument? In some cases, they have legal limitations. And this is the discussion we have been fueling these last months, and it is going to be present in the near future and will be a part of the heritage of this new High Representative. We have progressed quite a lot, but very little about what we still have to do. We still have a lot of work to coordinate the different member states with its own army, to get together to agree upon reinforcing the common action. But we will do that little by little, pace by pace. We will increase the production capacity, starting by ammunitions. We would prefer to have artillery bullets, for example, have more, better than manufacturing artillery bullets, but it's not the case. This war needs ammunitions, and Ukraine needs ammunitions. So look beyond this war. And if you look beyond this war, Europe will have to know if she wants to use the power of the language. The power is not only military, but it is also military. There are some moments where we need to use our armies and that has never been the case in Europe. So, and also the relationship with the U.S. U.S. has given us protection during the and after the Cold War. And it is clear many European countries think that the only way to have an ally that this ally should be the States, the U.S., and the structure should be the NATO. You can see in the politics says that the NATO flag is everywhere, more than the EU flag, because of historic reasons. And other European countries think and believe that we have to have a certain autonomous capabilities of the EU member states, more coordinated the better, not as an alternative to the NATO, but for those cases where the NATO cannot intervene, we could do it on our own. And here lies an opinion difference, important major difference of opinion, because some things that stronger we are, the Europeans, less incentives we have the U.S. to commit with our defense. That's what they say. And others think that on the opposite, if Europeans are stronger will be the NATO. So the commitment of the U.S. would be easier for them, because if Trump said something, and he was right. He said, you are not doing what you have to do to ensure your defense. You have to do something about that. That's what he said. And now the European average is 1.9 of the GDP, but other countries are in the 4, and countries are in the 1. This is the average only. So we have to harmonize the efforts, not only looking at the risk of each member state. Barbara, you have done a great work. That's why I invited you. We are going to provide you with the slides, because there are more slides in your presentation. So these slides are very interesting, and they show the industrial pillar, the military pillar, what does the Commission do, what is the work done by the different member states, what is the card, what is all these acronyms that are there, and that enables us to work together. I'm not going to ask you to study all that, but when you leave this room, if at least you have an idea of those terms, of those acronyms, if you get to know them, I think you will better understand all this topic. And with this, we are going to give the floor to the audience. A big round of applause to the speakers.
Vamos entonces a recoger las preguntas.
We are going to give you the floor. I'm going to first of all take three questions to begin, to start. Thank you. Juan Jesus from EUROPA. I've got a question for the High Representative about those foundational factors of the creation of the EU, these perfect spill-up. My question is the following. The current situation, the challenges we are facing in defense, those needs, can we compare them to the needs we had in the economic field?
A ver, ¿mejor ahora? Hola, hola, hola. Vale.
Okay. Repeat. The defense scenery and the challenges we're facing, Are they comparable with the circumstances when we have these spillover effects in the countries before the Union? Maybe it could be a way of getting closer together to have a more federal system, or maybe it could be a tough challenge, too complex, because we have a polarization of the different member states. To make the story short, the defenses issue and the challenges, is it comparable to the economic scenery existing when we create the coal and steel community? Is it a similar opportunity to cooperate, have a better European integration, or it's because you know what are our capacities, or do you believe it could be hindering our progress? And a last question about the Defense Commissioner. The acronyms are many, and it is quite complicated. The colors of white and black are not, but we have the gray colors. Is it a mistake to nominate this commissioner? And maybe it is a political move to reinterpret all the treaties, or maybe we could reinterpret all the treaties to grasp better the defense area. Or if the proposal is just to meet certain commitments.
Vamos a tomar otra que estaba por aquí delante y otra aquí.
Bueno, en primer lugar, gracias a los conferenciantes.
Thank you to the speakers. I'm going to be, as Federico Steinberg said, the issue of Taiwan. If we demonstrate that Ukraine participated in the destruction of the gasoduct Nord Stream, how would react the Union? Would they change the focus of the war or the approach? What would be the reaction of the EU in this situation?
Thank you. My name is Beatrice, and I'm just an anonymous member of the public. So my name is Beatrice, and I'm just an anonymous member of the audience. My question is directed at Barbara, but first I would like to thank you, Stephen. For those of us that have close personal links to the Ukraine and who know what our friends are going through, whether they live in Kiev, Lviv, or London, thank you for reminding us of the human dimension of this war. And to you, Barbara, I have a different question. We know that all European armies, and here I will take a step back before Brexit and include the UK, are having tremendous difficulties in recruiting both soldiers and officers. I know the UK Army reasonably well, also for family reasons, and they are anywhere between 20 and 25% below officer staffing levels. I suspect the same is true across the board. So how do you think, when you do your capability analysis, how important is it to bring back public opinion, and I won't even talk about hearts and minds, just basic public opinion, to the need for recruitment in Army, Navy, and Air Force? Thank you.
Gracias. Les paso la palabra.
Thank you. I give the floor to the speakers. Okay? Yeah, there's some things I cannot talk about. I'm sorry, I have a public function, a position. So about the Nord Stream, I understand your curiosity, but I'm not going to talk about that for obvious reasons. does defense can foster union, integration, or collaboration? Well, it should. That's my answer. It should. It is clear that the EU was created on the basis of market and economy. This was the objective. We have to reunite Europeans. We have been talking about suppressing borders or tariffs. We have been talking about a single currency, the single market, and competitiveness. All those terms are economic terms. And we have done quite good, quite well. But of course, there are nuances. But it has been quite all right for Spain. The adhesion to the EU was a sign of progress, as it has been for the countries of the Eastern Europe. When we say that the growth in Europe is X, if you see that regions, there are some, of course, some regions are above the average. Then Poland is growing a lot, as we did. And so the tools of the EU were economic. And the external trade is what we call an exclusive competence that does not require unanimity. And the Commission is the one passing or presenting the treaties that have to be passed by the member states, qualified majority. But if we should create this EU today, the member state wouldn't accept that the foreign trade should be a community competence. They wouldn't accept it because foreign trade is a geopolitical component. And when we created the EU, they were talking about the intra-community trade more among the European member states. And that's why they accepted. If we have created a single market, the different relationships should be smooth and should be the object of a community policy. The world wasn't globalized as today, and the export capacity in Spain was much more reduced. But today, trade is a weapon. And I doubt very much that today they will say, yes, I'm going to let you decide qualified majority, the trade or foreign trade. But now, currently, this is not enough. Well, it depends on what the EU wants. As Tsoukalis said the other day, if you want to be a geopolitical actor, you have to be more than economic power. If you want to be a free exchange area with a great power and a real power, then you can stay as you are. Can this lead us to a better, greater integration? Yes, it might be. I hope it will be, but we have to do that openly. And as it is enshrined in the treaties. We otherwise it will lead us to reluctancy on the behalf of the different member states. So, of course, the member states want the Commission to get involved and to distribute resources, but they forget that the resources distributed by the Commissions are their own resources, because the EU gets the help of the money from the member states. And they will say, well, we have a part of the pie, but you will have to pay that pie. So what I give, and the question is what I give and what I get. So that's why the member states said, well, I'm not going to fund the defense expenses. And others say, well, yes, if we have a common project, we should fund them in common, jointly. Yes, of course. And what are going to be the main beneficiaries of these common projects? That is the question. And then we can talk about the net income, what I give and what I get. In defense, this logic is not as easy because defense is a public good. Defense is good for all of us. And who is going to produce the common good of defense and security? According to the treaties, the member states. And these member states have to say, well, I'm going to put some money, but what we can't do is to do that behind the back or make decisions behind the back of the member states because they're going to refuse us decisions. So first of all, we have to make things smoothly, meeting the requirements and abiding by the rules. That's why when we say that sometimes we have to put some titles to the positions, these exist or these function exists, but they have to do something, for example. And we are in the world, as in Alice in Wonderworld. The important is who has the power, who has the command. This battle is for all political institutions. In all the institutions, there is a conflict for power, and this is unavoidable. And that's why we have invented treaties, Court of Justice, that we have to care about. In matters of defense, I hope that this is going to be another push or boost to the European Union. And I hope my successor will play a major role in this boost. The integrated Europe is going to be a part of this new history to protect its security and defense. And if it's not the case, this European Union will be will be lacking this pillar, which is of major importance.
It is a valid point because we talk about capabilities, and capability is plane, ships, and whatever, but then you also need the people there. Now, there was an interesting reflection that was done by the European Defence Agency also to show the value of the people. One of the lessons actually learned from Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine was that the importance of having trained people and motivated people. It made a difference also in Ukraine. Now, in Europe, it's a different situation. In some, of course, the conscription is something that is being discussed in each member state. There is no debate in that sense at European Union level on this, but in some national public opinion, there is the debate on whether it should be reconsidered, because now it's no longer compulsory. Most of the member states, there is this debate. What is being discussed at the European Union level, and I think the High Representative was referring to this before, is the work on preparedness. Now, this is different, but it's how to make sure that also the citizens are more sensitized about the threats. And this, in this sense, there is the former Finnish president, Niinistö, that has been tasked actually to reflect on this, and this is what he was referring to as the societal resilience. So, of course, it's different, but it's about how to bring also at the level of the single citizen this change of mindset and change of perspective in a world that is what it is.
Si no me equivoco, un país o estaba pensando.
If I'm not wrong, a country like Sweden was going to re-establish the obligatory military service.
Let's get some more questions.
Okay.
Bueno, muchas gracias por unas maravillosas.
Thank you so much for these wonderful interventions. And listening to you, 3 questions came to my mind, and they might seem strange to you. First of all, how are we helping Ukraine is providing them with weapons from our stocks, and then we renew them. Is this, does this mean that there is a reduction in the number or in the capacity and interoperability, or are we spending everything we can on this? Second question, for the CART to be operational, it needs the collaboration of member states. But to say what your decisions are regarding defense or your plans is quite a sensitive issue. Do the member states cooperate loyally? Or do you face a problem and sometimes have to make decisions in the blind? Third question, the announced white paper on defense, what content will it include if we already have an defense strategy or a strategy for the defense industry, and that's enough, isn't that so? Thank you. We have another question at the end of the room. Good morning, and thank you so much. I have 2 very specific questions. One is how, please, my first question is how we can bring together the security policy in the EU and NATO. I see there are different strategies, different interests, and different paths taken. An example of this is the sabotage to the Nord Stream, where there could be an involvement. Well, but we know part of the U.S. involved. And then my other question is about the future of Ukraine. We're talking about what is going to happen after the Ukraine war, and this would be linked to the support given to Ukraine, which is not enough. There's no progress, and the Russians are advancing. So what will be left of Ukraine after the war? Thank you. And one other question over here. Thank you. It's obvious that in the European defense or strategic autonomy, we have all the different acronyms, all the progress made when the High Representative has been fostering this. But I also believe what's obvious and what's boosted all of this were the 2008 financial crisis, because on our own we do nothing. We have to work together with others. Obviously, Trump in power with how he treated Europeans, COVID, and now the Ukraine war. Can we identify internal elements that also boost the Europe of defense that is not promoted or originated from abroad? And that brings me to a consideration that makes things even more complex. We think of the Europe of defense thinking about threats coming from outside. But what about the threats coming from inside? Because we have to convince the public opinion of the need of a Europe of defense that is more or less autonomous, complemented with NATO. But we're also seeing that we have Viktor Orban and others blocking whatever. We've seen the growth in the European elections of anti-Europeism, or at least of Euroscepticism. Therefore, we are feeding a dynamic that makes it difficult to convince the public opinion that the European project is appealing and makes sense. So the key, once again, I believe, is to mobilize political will, and to do so we need the public opinion. So let me introduce this issue. We talk about security to feel secure for what is coming from abroad. But human security is also linked to the fact that if population or an important part of the population of the 27 does not feel represented, does not feel that the welfare status is becoming worse, that there's precariousness and that there's less rights, it's very difficult to make Europe appealing, even more when national governments, whenever they have to impose a measure, always blame Brussels. Because, and I'm really sorry, but we didn't get the last part of that. The mic wasn't working. Sorry for that. Stephen?
My co-panelists more time to come up with their answers. So a few responses. On the Nord Stream issue, it sort of came up here and there. I have no particular insight, and people can read in the press, where you can see, whether this operation was or wasn't conducted with Ukrainian nationals, and then the question is, was there awareness, never mind approval at the political level? I think the indications are that there wasn't approval by the political level, that the president backed off from that, but I don't know more than that. In any case, I think our strategic support to Ukraine should not be made dependent on that specific issue. We have very, very, very strong reasons to support Ukraine, and the personal story that I brought here, I think, brings it home in a vivid manner, but there are all sorts of other more strategic reasons as well. On the question of what is left of Ukraine after the war, I mean, I share a little bit the worry that I detect in your question, but I would argue against fatalism. We have a say in this. We have a say in trying to shape the outcome of this war through the choices that we have made, and I think it's been suggested by everybody at this panel, we have done a lot, but also by the future choices that we will make. And I really want to plead against this sense of impotence, fatalism, Russia is going to win, Russia's too big, we can never get this. This is not true. This is within our capacity. There may be problems in the world, this is my view. Not sure if the High Representative agrees, but it's my view that exceed our capacity as European Union to have a really significant, meaningful, decisive influence over. But I think Ukraine is within our capacity to put it on a path towards victory, as I try to indicate, maybe not in the maximalist territorial sense, but in the sense of what kind of country Ukraine becomes at the end of all of this. A democratic country, a sovereign country, a country within the European country, a European future for Ukraine, I think is achievable. Just to give you one figure in all of this. Suppose the United States is out. Suppose the worst happens and X gets elected, or whatever system, problems happen in the American political system, and there's no more military support for Ukraine after November. Suppose that happens. The question is, can we step in? And doing so will cost, it is calculated, 0.8% of European GDP. 0.8%. Do not tell me we don't have that money. Do not tell me that that is exceeding our capacity given everything that is at stake. So I would caution against that sort of fatalism, and if the moment comes, mobilize ourselves and put ourselves to do that. Try to write my own handwriting here. Yes, public opinion and let's say concerns, and people sort of no longer supporting the broad European project. My read of the situation is, and it's supported by evidence from public opinion surveys, that this project, the Europe of defense, the securing our own future and security has broad European support. It's up of 75% percentage. People have their reservations about this or that aspect of the EU, and I'm not going to defend each and everything that happens in Brussels, clearly not. But this has broad mass support, and it's incumbent upon the various institutions in all their beautiful configurations, the Council, the Commission, to meet the demand of Europeans to feel and be protected. So I think that this is actually a case where we have to deliver. I've always been of the view that it would be better also sometimes to realign what the European Union does as the world changes, right? To have a better alignment between what Europe does and what people expect it to do. And this is difficult, because often when you start decades ago with doing something to then give it up, it's difficult. There's now a constituency behind it. But to make the point perhaps a bit more concrete, in terms of how we frame the European budget. Yep. Any budget for a political community is an expression of your priorities. Where do you put your money? And I think there's a lot of scope in the European budget to do what I propose, to reshift the priorities. We have, for all sorts of reasons, devoted more than 30% to agriculture, 30% to cohesion funding. That made a lot of sense for that period in time, but perhaps there is a case for readjusting, rebalancing those expenditure items in order to finance the kinds of things that we now need to do. And we've heard from Barbara and from the High Representative that we need to mobilize collective financial resources to achieve the goals we need, to incentivize the member states to do what they want, to fund these common projects. So perhaps that kind of shift from within the European budget from redistribution of the past towards financing collective public goods would have a lot of support, including in circles which are maybe not so Euro enthusiastic today. Thank you.
Perhaps I can pick up on a few other questions. There was the first question about the fact that we are supporting Ukraine and emptying the stockpilings. What is the implication in terms of also interoperability? Well, I would argue that precisely this is now the crunch time now, and it's all this reflection on investment and defense industry is timely now, precisely because most member states are, we will need to replenish their stockpiles. So the defense spending, the defense investment we have seen is increasing. So now the question is, how do we spend this money? And will we decide to spend it together or not? If we spend it together, this becomes an opportunity actually to improve interoperability, because then we can develop together, buy together. If we decide to go nationally, then the implication in terms of interoperability will go in a different direction. Then there was a question about the card. I was very proud that they start using these acronyms now, and how member states are cooperative in the process. Well, this has been going on already for several years, and that's precisely what is improving. It's true, sharing the information, it's not always sharing data, it may be sensitive, there is a trust building behind, and that's also why the European Defence Agency is very much engaged in this process. Basically, they really sit down with all the administration of the member states, sometimes also NATO. There was a question of NATO even is there, and it's improving. Also within PESCO now, not to complicate, but PESCO, there is also a part of commitments of the member states, and they need to report every year. They submit every year a national implementation plan to the PESCO Secretariat, which is basically the defense agency and the military staff, and we do then a report. So it's improving. It could be, we could do better, but it's trust building, and that's I mean, it's crucial also to improve the defense cooperation. Then maybe a few just additional elements on the NATO. Just to, I mean, there has been already discussed, of course, the cooperation with NATO here it's essential, but just to recall some facts, first of all, 23 of the 27 member states are also NATO members. A second element is what we call the principle of the single set of forces. When we talk about defense capability, it's not EU defense capability, it's member states defense capabilities that they can use in an EU framework, they can use in a NATO framework, or in any other framework. So when we boost and we build an EU level defense capability of member states, it's good also for NATO. And in all these processes, when we identify the priorities, there is a parallel NATO process, and there is coherence between, they talk to each other. So there are ways to, there is complementarity, and the case on Ukraine also in terms of complementarity was very clear. When we talk about collective defense, it's clear with us collective defense. But then as a European Union, we have many other tools. And in terms of, areas of cooperation, they are incredibly expanding. I don't know how many dialogues we have on so many issues. So it is growing in parallel. Of course, there are challenges, but I think we need to look at that from that perspective.
First of all, regarding Ukraine, we will have a session this afternoon with experts. So let's not say anything or much more before the experts speak this afternoon. Secondly, when you talk about, or your question about cooperation and a loyal cooperation, well, this question was already answered by Barbara. It's obvious when you try to coordinate the groups, they need to coordinate because if not, the result is useless. And I believe it is useful. The two documents or key documents for European defense of the defense agency that I have the honor to chair, I believe are useful because they create a map of what are the capabilities of the different European armies. That, of course, is what they say that they're capable of, but there's lots of information, and if it's not there, it's not there. But another thing is the capabilities that we should all have together. That's an exercise of taking the pieces of the puzzle and trying to make the puzzle so that they look like the objective that we've set for ourselves. So amongst all of us, what do we have? What are we missing? Do we need to have refueling capacity? Yes, of course. Do we have it? It doesn't seem so. Then we will have to build it. Do we have drones? Well, it seemed that we didn't have much a couple of days ago, so we need that. And this is what the documents does. It gives us a situation or explains what we have, and it compares it to what we need. And that is the capacity development plan at the end of the day. And this is an exercise that is very complex because I insist we're not a state. We cannot demand things that are impossible for the EU as a non-state. Therefore, it doesn't have nor the powers nor the competences of a state. And the member states have kept to themselves some of these capacities, like, for example, defense. So we want to increase defense capacity of the whole. Because believe me, if each European state increases their expense in defense according to what they already have, so if we look at this mathematically and they multiply it by 1 point or whatever, and everyone does exactly the same thing, the final result will be a big waste of money. Because we will not only reduce having the same capabilities in other places, but we will be filling in the gaps existing in the system. So when we say, yes, we need to invest more in defense, we have to ask ourselves, who? Because in defense, only states can invest. Are they going to do it on their own, or are we going to work together? And if the answer is yes, how do we structure this, doing this together? Taking into account the European budget with an other fund, that we have to know how we're going to work with this money. If we've Because sometimes we decide, well, this is what we're going to contribute, and this is the way in which it's going to be distributed. Maybe this is easier for agricultural products surplus than for the rebuilding of our military capacity. I hope I've explained myself. It's we're going to do this. Who? The states. How? Each with their own agenda? No. Then we need a common agenda. And how is this structured? Are we going to have a specific fund for defense, which is the proposal of my colleague Breton? Who's paying for this fund? Who's financing everything? Because it can only be funded with the contributions from states unless we invest a new military tax in Europe. These are all questions that are in the air and I don't have an answer for. In any case, I do not believe we've done nothing, because when we say we're going to have a white paper on defense, well, it already exists. It's called the Strategic Compass. It's not called the white paper for defense. Maybe we should have. It would be more appealing, more sexy, because Strategic Compass, and people don't know what it's about. But the Strategic Compass is the white paper for European defense, because it's been approved by defense ministers to start with, and it says what has to be done, who we need to partner with, and how we need to be organized to supply more security. So that's what a white paper on defense will talk about. Maybe it needs to be updated. Of course, it has to be updated because things are happening meanwhile. But a white paper on European defense in capital letters is something that cannot be done by the Commission. It doesn't have the powers to do so. If I say, well, we're going to publish the white paper on the defense industry in Europe, then yes. But for defense, it already exists. And of course, it has to be done in cooperation with the Commission. And I'm sure my successor will do so, because it is a part of the duties he has. There's already a white paper that has to be updated and has to be done so jointly with the Commission. Perfect. Everyone contributes to it, but the Commission in itself cannot do so.
¿Quién y cómo se organiza la OTAN?
Who and how do we organize NATO and the member states? It's exactly the same thing. Security is a competence of the states, and NATO members create a shared security in the framework of NATO. And NATO is a military group that deploys forces, but not the EU. For example, I was in the Baltic area, and there are NATO forces that, of course, are members of the European armies, but they work under the NATO flag. But the EU does not deploy combat missions. They do so for other kinds of missions. For example, I've been in the Red Sea on an Italian and a Greek ship, in the Aspides ship under a European defense flag. But it wasn't for fighting. And it's there to defend the other ships there, but it won't attack the Houthis. It won't bomb their bases in Yemen. That's not its mission. They cannot do it. It's not their mandate. But NATO does have this kind of missions if necessary. Aren't we a military union? But we have the ambition of having a common defense policy. And what are going to be the elements included? What is it made of? And that's what Barbara explained. With 5,000 people deployed in what we call military missions that are not executive missions in military language, because they're not going to fight. And if one of the ships in the ASPA mission would have to fight, this would be under a national mandate, and immediately. I hope you understand the subtleties here because they are important. So we are going to progress step by step, and we're going to progress by building the European pillar in NATO. That in NATO, Europe has its European or pan-European contribution. That's what I believe. I don't know if everyone agrees with this idea, but many countries do defend this European pillar in NATO. And of course, there's no alternative for territorial defense of Europe. So I think I've left nothing. Do we have time for one more question? Excuse me. I think we need to differentiate between problems and threats. Threat is a problem, and not all problems are threats. So no doubt, specific political positions in the EU on behalf of some states are a problem for the Union, but I wouldn't say they are a threat. When we say that there are threats, so I wouldn't put all the problems together because we won't solve anything. And there's a problem regarding perception, citizenship perception, and citizens need to be aware that Europe is a source of solutions and not of problems. And now there are many problems that cannot be solved because we don't have the capacity. For example, housing. We're going to have a commissioner for housing. I think that's excellent, but the commission doesn't have competences, power in housing. Will they have it? They will have to invent it, because if there's a commissioner, he or she would have to do something. So we will develop a common policy for housing, with what resources, with what capabilities. We will have to see and look into that. But the institutions do what they have the power to do, and what they have resources for. And that's what happens in democracy. Institutions don't do whatever they want. They do what they've been created for, with the powers that they have and the resources that have been allocated to them. And if there are no competences nor resources, then it's just decoration. That people cannot live with decoration. They want practical solutions. So welcome the Commissioner for Housing, but we have to see what he or she can do, what are the resources allocated, and what's their capacity to do things. Because in Spain, for example, it's a competence of the autonomous communities. So we hope that in this way we can develop and have more resources. But today's session was about external threats. Yes, external threats and not so much internal threats. We will talk about internal threats another day. But today we wanted to speak about external threats and highlight that the fact that when Javier Solana was heading this, he would say Europe has never been so prosperous nor been so secure. And now we cannot say that. Europe has never been so secure? Nope. Europe is now facing threats. Threats that come from outside, not always in a missile, can come through a cyber attack or a terrorist attack, or because immigrants recruited these poor people that are recruited in poor countries, and you tell them, here, have a ticket to a flight ticket, and I will take you to Europe, and they are pushed towards a closed border. That's a threat too. Because if it's one person, but if it's hundreds, how can we have political regimes that recruit poor, desperate people and say to them, I'm going to take you to Europe, take this plane. And when they get there, they push them towards a closed border. That is a threat. Some people don't have weapons. They're not just going to attack anyone in the border, but they are deceived when they get there. And what do they try to do to get in?
Because someone told them that they could enter. So who is to fight? Who is our enemy? Those who are doing that, it is sometimes a foreign state. It is not an NGO or an organization. It is a state that is going to recruiting people to get them to the border of Europe, cheating on them. And some, they lose their life. They don't make it to Europe. And this is a threat. So we have to fight against these kind of actions. The threats, of course, they're coming from abroad. They're not only military threats. Some are, but not all. Some, even though they're not military, they are really major threats. The President von der Leyen took a wonderful initiative, is to try to address the capacities or capabilities of society to be able to face a crisis situation. There are countries where the war risk is very much present, and they are ready for that. Other countries where war has disappeared, and it is unimaginable to be facing a war. We are not ready for this kind of situation, and this is not possible. You have mentioned the sentences of the Solana's defense strategy, the strategy compass, and also you have mentioned the global strategy on Mogherini that was presented 2-3 days after the referendum on Brexit. And we had, or they had to change the introduction text to talk about the other kind of threats. Brexit wasn't mentioned. It was the exit of the UK. I think we have to stop now. We have been addressing our defense capabilities with the UK, the country that has more power in defense capabilities. And now we are facing a new stage to try to better coordinate these capabilities. I don't know. We can address this or we can stop. I think I'm afraid we have to stop. Can we think that the UK is in the NATO, as we are all in the NATO? We get together, we coordinate, but it's not the case. When we talk about the NATO pillar, it is important to think about the fact that UK is or not. But now it is not the case. So I have been talking with my colleagues of the new Labour government, and they are ready to work together and with the EU to reach agreements. I've signed one not long ago with Norway, and we have in the pipeline other agreements with other countries. One with Norway or Moldavia that is not in the NATO. It's not in NATO. And we hope we will have the UK also joining. Thank you. Thank you to the speakers. So, see you again at